Here's an experiment for you. Take passionate experts in human resource technology. Invite cross-industry experts from inside and outside HR. Mix in what's happening in people analytics today. Give them the technology to connect. Hit record. Pour their discussions into a beaker. Mix thoroughly. And voila, you get the HR Data Labs podcast, where we explore the impact of data and analytics to your business. We may get passionate and even irreverent, but count on each episode challenging and enhancing your understanding of the way people data can be used to solve real-world problems. Now, here's your host, David Turetsky.
Hello and welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast. I'm your host, David Turetsky. Like always, we try and find phenomenal people, guests from inside and outside of HR, to give us the scoop as to what's happening in the worlds of HR data, analytics, HR technology trends. Today we have with us our friend and colleague, Garry Straker, VP of Compensation Consulting from Salary.com. Hey, Garry, how you doing?
Hi, David. Nice to see you. Good afternoon, Dwight.
Hey, Garry. Good to have you here.
Nice to be here.
And always we have our trusted friend and co-host, the man who has the deep voice, Dwight Brown from Salary.com. Dwight, how are you doing?
I am doing spectacular.
There's that voice.
It's a good day.
Today, we have a very special topic, but first, I'd love it if, Garry, you could give us a few minutes on who you are and what brought you to this moment.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be a part of your podcast here. So again, my name is Garry Straker. I'm a Vice President of Compensation Consulting at Salary.com, and I'm someone who has been consulting in the area of total rewards for just about 25 years. And during that time, I've had a chance to work with clients really all over the country in different pay markets, helping them build market-aligned, internally equitable, sustainable total compensation plans that really help, drive their businesses forward, and really loved that work. It's been a lot of fun. And recently, in the last few months, it has never been more challenging given the dynamics of the current labor market. So Absolutely. Never a dull moment, David.
No, it's a lot of fun. And our topic today, which will kind of bring that out, has been making it even more fun, but we'll get to that in a second. But the one fun thing that we do for each of our guests is to put them on the spot and ask one thing that no one knows about you, Garry.
Well, I'm not quite sure that no one knows about it, David, but very few people do. And that one thing is I actually have a background in theatrical production. And in my prior life, I worked as a stage manager and at one point had the privilege and honor of working for the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford-upon-Avon and London, England, taking productions of Shakespeare around the world. And
that is cool.
And that stems from the fact I actually have an undergraduate degree in theater production.
Wow. I have a newfound respect for how dramatic you are.
Hey, theatrical training comes into play in the consulting arena,
Absolutely.
Right?
A lot of transferable skills.
Absolutely. Keeping a straight face when clients say things.
Yeah.
And I love my clients. I really do. Today, we get to talk about a really key topic and one that has been in the fore for many years, but no more so than it is today, and that is pay equity and what's going on in the pay equity landscape. And we're living it. And in fact, Garry Straker is the embodiment of the compensation professional who's kind of really taking a lead on it, especially at Salary.com. So, Garry, this is going to be a fun one.
Thank you.
So, Garry, explain to us and explain to people who may not really even know what it is. I mean, they may understand it from their own world and maybe even their own compensation, but tell us, what is pay equity?
I want to take a break real quick just to let you know about a new show we've just added to the network. Up Next at Work, hosted by Gene and Kata Keel of the Devon Group. Fantastic show. If you're looking for something that pushes the norm, pushes the boundaries, has some really spirited conversations, Google Up Next at Work, Gene and Kata Keel from the Devon Group.
That's an interesting question, David, because I think pay equity in terms of how we define it has evolved and changed, particularly in recent years. And, as a result of many different factors. But today, when we talk about pay equity, we're really talking about a general sense of fairness in the workplace. And, historically, pay equity, going back to 1963 when the Equal Pay Act was passed, we thought about pay equity as equal pay for equal work. And I think most of us conceptually can get our arms around that and sort of understand what that means. But today's world is different, and the workplace has evolved, employee expectations have evolved, and when we talk about pay equity nowadays, we're typically using that term pretty broadly.
Right.
And so pay equity can mean everything from looking at and addressing the gender and or racial pay gaps that exist within the workplace. And, as you know, and that's what gets a lot of the media attention, that's the sort of the general average pay difference between different demographic groups relative to white men.
Right.
And there's certainly a lot of organizations are paying a lot of attention and focusing on that, typically as part of their diversity, equity, inclusion goals. And the pay gap is more of a function less of pay than it is about representation. But that is an important piece of what we think about today when we talk about pay equity. And pay equity can also mean dealing with identifying and addressing pay disparities that exist in the workplace, which cannot be explained for legitimate, permissible job-related factors. And obviously, that is an illegal pay practice.
Right.
And so there's good reasons to avoid that. You obviously want to keep yourselves out of court. But, I think even beyond those two things, pay equity can also just be about equal opportunity in the workplace.
Right.
And certainly there's so much focus on that as a result of the strategic focus on diversity, equity, inclusion. Really, virtually every corporation in the United States has a priority around that. And so I think, in today's world, the definition and how we look at pay equity has evolved and changed. And even within, certain organizations, it may mean different things.
I think you brought up a really interesting point, which I want to tug on a little bit, which is there's a difference between regulation and cultural implications of pay equity, right? So a company might want to be an employer of choice and therefore have aspirations of pay equity, but they also need to follow the regulations of pay equity that exist in the locale, whether it's a municipality or the federal government, whatever it is. Can you talk to what's the big difference between, the regulations and actually just good corporate practice?
Yeah, I mean, that you're really kind of hitting the nail on the head in terms of, I think, what the priorities are in today's workplace. And it used to be that, we were more concerned about the compliance issues, right? And making sure that we were on the right side of the law.
Right.
But, I think for a lot of organizations, those days are behind us. And now it is more about culture. It is more about trying to elevate the employee experience and differentiating yourself as an employer in choice in whatever way you can. And for a lot of organizations, that is about being more transparent about pay. It's about creating pay practices and policies that are better understood, and just addressing the overall concern and expectation that employees have that pay will be administered fairly within the organizations they work.
Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss a show by clicking subscribe. This podcast is made possible by Salary.com. Now, back to the show.
I think that gets us to our next question, and we'll probably spend a bulk of our time on this question, which is how pay equity has kind of evolved the compensation process, as it were, because we used to be able to just market price jobs and kind of go home and be okay. Everything will be okay.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And for many years now, market pricing has been the predominant approach to, administering pay within our organizations. And that's, was partly because data just became much more sort of available and accessible. And I know you remember the days when we used to get 3-ring binders, 6 inches thick with pay data. And it was laborious and tedious to have to wade your way through all that. But nowadays we don't do that. We have access to data and technology really at our fingertips whenever we want. But, the focus on pay equity really requires a more balanced approach. Certainly market data is always going to be important, and having, that market reference is really going to help make, hopefully, well-informed, good decisions as it relates to pay. But nowadays, I think we have to look at it, again, more broadly. We can't just hang our hat exclusively on market pricing. Right. I'm seeing a much more focus on, trying to be a little bit more consistent, a little bit more disciplined and structured around how we administered pay. Sure. And, there's still obviously, times when you have to, I'm going to use the term shoot from the hip. But nowadays, that comes with a significant amount of risk, particularly given the level of scrutiny and focus around pay equity. So I'm seeing just a need to take a much more balanced approach. Yes, we're going to always sort of look at market pricing to help inform and guide compensation decisions, but increasingly so, we're going to use that in balance with the need to, maintain internal equity.
You brought up before the word transparency, and I think that where you're going as well, where you're talking about more structure, more rules, and consistency, brings up the point where companies are asking for and employees are pushing for more transparency to understand, how is my salary derived? How is my merit increase derived? And some of the clients that I'm working with right now, they are doing compensation studies specifically so they can drive more transparency in their pay processes. And therefore, when and as we're deriving not only the market pricings, but also the structures, along the way, we have to think about, how are we going to be explaining this? And how are we going to be communicating this? So to me, that kind of also puts an important pressure point on an old practice that we use, salary structures, and how are we going to modernize it and make it more transparent?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, I think, one of the most important trends we've seen maybe in the last 12 months is an increasing level of transparency. That, in part, by the way, has been driven by some of the legislative activity around the country. And so I think we're up to 7 or 8 states now that have require some sort of wage range disclosure in their job postings. Yeah. Only 2 states in the country and New York City actually require wage range disclosures in job postings. So, I think that that's being pushed in part legislatively, but I think more and more organizations are starting to see the value and merits of including that pay data up front. And even in those markets that don't have those types of laws in place, we are seeing employers move towards, including wage ranges in job postings and certainly making it available to job candidates up front. And I think that helps, first of all, manage expectations, but I think it can also create a more efficient recruitment process. And, to the extent that, the practice in the past was that you never really had that compensation discussion until you got down to the wire. Right. I mean, think of how much time and effort and how many interviews have gone through the recruitment process before you actually get down to the wire. And of course, that's where the rubber meets the road. And I think providing that level of disclosure up front is going to provide a more efficient process. It's going to manage expectations more effectively. And it's also, I think, going to communicate and signal to job candidates a little bit about your culture, right? And what your values are. And hopefully establish and build trust right from the get-go, because that's one of the greatest benefits of transparency is it sort of builds trust and gives employees confidence and comfort that their organization's pay practices are aligned with values that are important to them.
It's interesting because when I tell friends and acquaintances what I do, I've been really struck by the fact that I've been consistently getting the question from them, why is it that employers never post their pay in a job posting? Yeah. And the truth of the matter is there's no good answer for that. I think there were justifications there, but when it really comes down to it, it is a little bit counterintuitive as to why we would have this established practice. And then when I talk with them about the fact that we now legislatively are seeing states mandate this, their reaction is good. It's about time.
Yeah, one of the fascinating things about it is culture.
Right.
I worked for financial services institutions that said, if employees start talking about pay, it goes bad fast. And therefore, we're going to make it, and I'm going to use this word, don't quote me on it. No, none of you on the podcast quote me on this. Illegal, right? We're going to make it illegal. And so we're going to not just frown upon it, but we're going to warn people that if you continue to talk about pay, you'll be put on warning and could be fired for it. Because they just didn't want to get into those situations where they had to explain differences in pay, especially given the fact that while base pay didn't really matter in financial services, it was really about the bonus. They didn't want people talking about their bonus or their LTI package, because that's where it would go really horribly wrong.
Yeah.
And so that secrecy and that veil of secrecy led to kind of a tense balance between giving them enough information and giving them the information they needed to be a party or a business partner in those discussions.
Yeah, and I think, David, that sort of level of transparency and that trend that we're seeing goes beyond just beyond the workplace and employees. Other stakeholders have a vested interest in seeing more as it relates to human capital practices and pay practices specifically. And that's one of the reasons why the SEC has indicated that they may be introducing some more stringent rules as it relates to human capital risk information that will need to be reported by publicly traded companies. And that one will include, by the way, things like potentially the pay gap difference that exists in your organization, any pay equity claims or lawsuits. And I think the SEC is recognizing that human capital risk is investment risk. And when you start getting the attention and the focus of the investors, that has a way of changing things.
We had Regulation SK, I guess it may be a year ago now, maybe a little bit more, which did start talking about the mandated disclosure of material HR metrics. And while they didn't specify which metrics they were, I think a lot of us who follow it were very surprised that they did not specify things like pay equity or pay gaps or things like that. So I totally agree with you. And I think it's a really good trend. Hopefully it will be there, because as these things start coming out into light, especially if it does increase risk, then people are going to vote with their feet, especially investors. And it will, I hate to use the word punish, but it will definitely have a lot of impact to organizations that don't take it as seriously or don't follow it.
David, I anticipate someday in the future where my analogy is, how much time and effort we spend in choosing colleges for our children. I have 3 children. And so when you started, to go down that path, you looked at things like graduation rates and class sizes and crime on campus, and you looked at all these different things. But nowadays, we get out of college and we go join an employer. We didn't know anything about them.
That's right.
And we're just thinking, we had a couple of interviews, we met a couple of nice people, and we thought, that looks good to me. But I see a time in the future where those types of disclosures, especially around environmental, social, and governance issues, and again, human capital risks, I think employees are going to expect to see it. And those are the things that we'll be looking for when we go and maybe submit a job application. There'll probably be some report that we're going to want to see before we even consider throwing our hat in the ring.
Absolutely. It's really funny you bring up the ESG, because we just had Susan Hunt-Stevens on talking about ESGs in today's organizations and talking about how serious it is and how it's really changing the equation for how organizations are looked by, not just by employees, but by investors. So good shout out to Susan Hunt-Stevens for episode 19 of the HR Data Labs podcast. So Gary, we're going to transition and go to question 3, which is, what other trends are you seeing in the workplace that relate to pay equity?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we just covered one of those, and that was transparency. Sure. But I think really what I'm seeing is greater utilization and optimization of technology as it relates to compensation administration. And you and I have been doing this long enough that when spreadsheets came along, we thought that was the best thing since sliced bread.
It was.
But we know how cumbersome and challenging it can be to administer pay for a complex organization across different locations and hundreds of different jobs to try to pull all the market data together and be able to do that efficiently. And so I think one of the things we're seeing is more utilization and optimization of technology, particularly as it relates to pay equity, because as you know, a pay equity audit or pay equity analysis does require some fairly sophisticated, robust statistical modeling, and being able to do that within a software platform that houses all your compensation data and employee demographic information is just going to allow you to do that more efficiently, more routinely, and consistently across the organization. So, obviously, at salary.com, we're in the technology business. We're in the technology
I knew there was
going
to be a comp analyst plug in there somewhere.
So
thank you, Gary.
This is music to our ears, but
yes.
I think demand for that is just going to increase.
Well, and it has to, right? And there's going to be more sophisticated algorithms that come out. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is get to a consistent approach, right? And it's not necessarily the sophistication of the approach as it is the applicability of the approach and the ability to explain it too. And I'm not just talking about to plaintiffs' attorneys or to defendants. I'm talking about it in the way in which you're explaining how and what you do to your employees, right? And making sure they understand it, talking about transparency. I don't think there's a day soon where we're going to explain to them the pay equity analysis. Mm-hmm. But what we can do is explain that we are looking out for you and we're trying to take care of you by making sure that the right people are being reviewed and that the organization is doing the right things on your behalf. Yeah. That's a level of transparency that hopefully we can get to, but I'm not sure that's going to come soon. But that would be good.
I think I agree with you, David. I mean, transparency is a continuum, and there's a lot of people who will shudder at the mention of transparency and just feel as though they're not quite ready for it. And, probably the greatest opponents of transparency are those that, maybe haven't had this sort of structure and discipline around their pay practices and know that there's probably some skeletons in the closet there that we are not ready to reveal yet. So for a lot of organizations, I think it's going to be incremental steps. I think there's a lot of housekeeping that needs to be done, an analysis, around pay equity. And, I know this is in your wheelhouse, you and Dwight, but, understanding and maintaining your data and the integrity of your data is just going to be critical, I think, going forward. And so I think organizations are really going to have to, focus on that as well.
It seems also, at least from my working with various clients, that there seems to be a shift where people genuinely are wanting to adopt pay equity practices and wanting to understand what's going on in their organizations. It's kind of moved beyond this point where it is a mandate for people to this point where people have that desire and they're like, I want to have equitable pay practices within my organization. But it's a shift. And then, like you talked about, Gary, the next question is, how can we utilize our data to evaluate this? People are hungry for it. It's not something that they're just going out and checking a box because it's some sort of legislative mandate. There's a true desire that's coming through. And I think that this is a good shift in the right direction.
Yeah, I think it's very, very positive. I think it's going to take a while for everyone to get comfortable with it, at least in some organizations. But, I think, we've heard so much about, the large corporations who have, committed to pay equity within their organizations and publicly announced, that they've achieved a milestone when it comes to pay equity. And so the Salesforces of the world, the Starbucks of the world have been very, very visible and vocal, the work that they have done in this area. But that has a way of trickling down. And I think eventually, even small employers are going to have to invest time and energy in dealing with this issue in a way that they maybe have not done in the past.
I think it gets down to who are the participants in those conversations as well. Who are the consumers? And to me, there are two parties that really need a lot more help, and that's managers and employees. Managers need to have the right tools at their fingertips to be able to not only make the right pay decision based on new policies that you brought up before, Gary, but also the support of their HR team to be able to make the right decisions, to be given the right information, to be given the right policies, and told how to do what they should be doing. I forgot one group in there, which is recruiters. Recruiters are really special people, and they really need a lot of assistance in making sure that they're not getting bargains, that they're finding the right people at the right job at the right time, and being able to make the right decision for both the employer as well as the candidate. And again, getting the right training based on what we were talking about before. And then the employee is another really important, I would say, node in this, which is you need to be able to communicate with them what it all means. You got to break it down for them in real brass tacks so that they really understand why and what and how. It's not going to make you rich. We're not bringing everybody up here to this level, but what it's supposed to do is make sure that you're paid fairly amongst your peers, or whatever the interpretation is for that particular company. And I think if we don't take those groups and make sure that they're a party to this, then I think we'll have missed the boat.
Yeah, David, I agree with you 100%. I mean, this just can't, I hate the notion of comp directors or HR directors being the police around this issue, or just pay generally.
Right.
And organizationally, that's a real disservice, I think, to employees and managers. But there is an education process that needs to happen, and there is some level of accountability that anyone who supervises employees needs to embrace, and that is, be able to have a basic conversation in layman's terms: why pay, how you're paid, what you're paid, and I always say, how much is really important, but how can be equally as impactful. Exactly. And if you don't know how. Yeah. You know how much almost it doesn't matter.
Totally agree. So Gary, today we talked about the really critical, important business topic of pay equity. We talked about how the focus on it has changed compensation practices and what trends happen in the workplace because of pay equity. What else did you want to impart to our listeners today?
Yeah, I think we have to remember that all this focus and attention around pay and pay equity, it is all focused on the employee experience. And sometimes we get so, we get our head down and we focus on the weeds so much, and we fail to sort of remember and recognize that ultimately this is about trying to create an environment where employees hopefully can come to work every day with their intention of being the best version of themselves, without the distractions or concern or doubt or mistrust as it relates to their pay. And if they feel as though that they are being fairly treated, then I think you've gone a long way to elevating that employee experience in a way that hopefully allows you to keep them, longer and recruit new employees, which in today's labor market, we know how difficult that is.
Absolutely. Gary, thank you so much. We learned a lot about pay equity today and really appreciate you attending.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you. Dwight, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Gary, for being here. This has been really informative.
And thank you all for listening. And if you like this episode, please don't hesitate to forward it to your friends and neighbors and parents. And if you really like the episode, please follow us. Thank you very much. Take care and stay safe.
That was the HR Data Labs podcast. If you liked the episode, please subscribe. And if you know anyone that might like to hear it, please send it their way. Thank you for joining us this week, and stay tuned for our next episode. Stay safe.